Thank you for joining us tonight. We are currently playing a pre-event slideshow. The first slide shows the live logo in gold on a white background with the text, "Live from NYPL and Common Sense Media present, Which Side of History? Chelsea Clinton and Jim Steyer, May 24th, 2021, 7 p.m. Eastern Time." This slide shows the featured book. The cover is burgundy red with the title in large block letters. Which Side of History? How Technology is Reshaping Democracy and Our Lives. The words "side of" are flipped horizontally. Which Side of History is available for purchase online from the library shop, on.nypl.org/shop-live. Proceeds benefit the New York Public Library. Reserve a copy for free with a New York Public Library card. Visit tonight's event page to find this title in a variety of formats, nypl.org/live. The last slide contains recommended reading. NYPL suggests these titles for further reading: Irresistible by Adam Alter, Digital Minimalism by Cal Newport, The Big Disconnect by Catherine Steiner Adair, Glow Kids by Nicholas Carderas, The Shallows by Nicholas Carr. Check out the full list and other titles by tonight's speakers by visiting tonight's event page, nypl.org/live.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us at Live from NYPL. I'm Tony Marks. I'm the president of the New York Public Library, and it's my honor and privilege to welcome you to tonight's event featuring Jim Steyer and Chelsea Clinton. Jim, as we know, is the founder and CEO of Common Sense Media, and Chelsea is vice chair at the Clinton Foundation. They've both been incredible friends of mine, of the libraries, supporters of so many important causes and addressing so many pressing issues. It's an honor to have them with us. Not long ago, the subject of tonight's talk, teens and tech and mental health, didn't seem like it could have gotten any more crucial. And then one global pandemic later, with life having moved online to a remarkable extent that it has in these past 14 or so months, especially for young people and education, the subject took on startling new dimensions. Back in 2018, Common Sense released a report on how tech was impacting the mental and physical health of teens, for better and for worse. Now, with so much changed, they've commissioned a second study as follow-up. And the results, which were published just recently, give us a lot to think about. Among some of the report's key findings, depression reported among 14 to 22-year-olds has increased significantly in just the past few years. Exposure to hate speech among young people in the same age range is also up. At the same time, nearly half of young people say that social media has been central to staying informed and connected during the pandemic, and that they have made extensive use of digital health options, especially young people who report depression. At the New York Public Library, our caring young adult staff center Teen Voice, mental health and social emotional skills in all of our programming. Through our college and career pathways program, youth technology, and the many other daily programs and services in our neighborhood branches, we offer teens safe space to connect with each other, share their unique ideas and perspectives, and discuss how we can work together to build community, both online and in person. To that end, we integrate essential literacies that prepare and activate teens for an evolving digital reality. We teach them digital and other technological skills, from coding to blogging to video production, using cutting-edge tech and vetted digital platforms. And we discuss how to gather, analyze, and share information that is accurate and builds community instead of tearing it down or tearing it apart. You can find links to many of these resources on tonight's event page, as well as more info about Common Sense and the report. We very much appreciated a long-term partnership with Common Sense Media, whom we've looked towards to train our staff and provide the latest information on quality digital platforms to use with our teens. Among all of the other incredible work Jim does with Common Sense, last year he also published an outstanding new collection of essays entitled Which Side of History? How Technology is Reshaping Democracy and Our Lives. Featuring an amazing array of contributors working in tech, education, public policy, and more, the essays in the book focus on the extraordinary impact of technology, not just on kids and families, but also on our privacy, race and gender roles, democracy, climate change, and mental health. The deeply impressive list of contributors to the book includes Sacha Baron Cohen, Mark Benioff, Tim Wu, Khalid Hosseini, Nicholas Kristof, Cheryl Wudunn, Jaron Lanier, Jeffrey Canada, Saul Khan, Sherry Turkle, Shoshana Zuboff, and many more. Among that list, of course, are also tonight's speakers. At the Clinton Foundation, much of Chelsea's work focuses on promoting early brain and language development through the Too Small to Fail initiative. She also serves on the boards of the Clinton Health Access Initiative and the Alliance for a Healthier Generation. As for Jim, Common Sense Media is the nation's leading independent nonprofit organization dedicated to creating a powerful voice for kids and families in the 21st century. And the book, Which Side of History, is available at the library, but it is also available for purchase from the library shop, and proceeds go to the benefit the library. You can find a link to the shop in the chat and on the event page. If you have an NYPL card or live in New York State and want to apply for one, again, you can always borrow the book for free from us. Jim and Chelsea would love to answer some of your questions toward the end of this chat. You can send them at any time by using the chat Google form or by emailing publicprograms, one word, at nypl.org. We've also received a few pre-taped questions from teens in our networks, and we're especially excited to hear from the people who are directly affected by what we're discussing. Quickly, before I turn it over to Jim and Chelsea, the library values your privacy. So I want you to know that even though this video and chat are on an nypl.org page, they are hosted by YouTube. By participating in the chat, you might share data about yourself, which the library cannot and does not control. Okay, thank you so much for joining us, and please welcome Jim Steyer and Chelsea Clinton.
Hi, Jim.
Hi, Chelsea. Great to be here.
Great to be with you. And I want to thank the library for hosting us, even virtually, although I'm very sad that we cannot be there in person yet.
Soon we will be able to see Tony and everybody at the library. I agree.
And I just have to apologize to everyone that I am sick. And so I'm also quite grateful that we are virtual so that I could be here tonight, because otherwise I wouldn't feel responsible being in person. But I hope that you will forgive my raspy voice, and if I cough at awkward moments, which somehow feels much more awkward in 2 dimensions than it feels in 3 dimensions, I hope you'll forgive me. Well, Jim, should we just start our conversation?
I'm ready. I'm totally ready, Chelsea. Absolutely.
Well, I think, what I would like to hear from you, and I'm sure our audience would as well, is in addition to what Tony mentioned, what were some of the other, really salient, even painful findings from the recent Common Sense research on how kind of teens' use of technology and interactions with technology have changed over the course of the pandemic?
Well, Chelsea, I was so glad Tony brought that up, and it's a great way to start, because this has been an extraordinary 15 months for all of us. I think about you as a mom with kids. I know it's been incredible for us. We've had our youngest son at home during the pandemic the entire time, taking classes on Zoom and literally only going back to school about a month ago. I know I can only imagine what that's been like for you as a mom. And
well,
so many
it's given me a window into my daughter's kindergarten class when she's been virtual. And I have to say, just a major amount of gratitude to all of the teachers who have adapted with just extraordinary kind of brilliance and effectiveness under extraordinary circumstances, often without, candidly, the sufficient support that they should always have. And it's been a particular joy, Jim, for me to hear PE class, which seems to always be really amazingly energetic, even on a screen.
But I agree with you.
You were telling me about your older children.
Yeah, but I know, but I'm thinking of, you knew my children originally when they're your kids' age. And it's amazing that first of all, the shout out to the teachers and the educators across the country who had to go through this. And all of the parents who also then had to work from home and deal with all the other stresses, people losing your jobs, losing so many different aspects of your life for 15, now going on 15 months. And then trying to parent, trying to keep things okay for your kids. And by the way, and I'll get to the mental health stuff in just 1 second, it was really interesting for Common Sense because we had a huge upsurge in traffic on the consumer platform. On the schools platform, we worked with a bunch of the guys who wrote pieces for the book, like Sal Khan and National Geographic and Scholastic and others, to build Wide Open School, which became this very big distance learning portal that teachers could use to give good content to K through 12 students around the United States. The other thing I would mention before I talk about the mental health is we had to relax our screen time rules. You know, Tony mentioned in the introduction how we've been for well over 15 years now, a guide to hundreds of millions of parents about screen time and the fact that it's so important to limit how much time we all spend in front of a screen, whether it's on your phone or on your computer or a video game machine or whatever. And a lot of those rules really had to be changed during the pandemic because we were all cooped up at home. And because we were doing work this way, our kids were going to school this way. I taught with as you know, with your dad, I taught a class at Stanford with 1,700 students.
I taught this way.
It was so interesting. So everything, it's been, and by the way, nothing will be the same going forward. That's the other thing I would say, and we can come back to that. But I really do that education is now going to be changed forever. And in many ways, in a positive way. And I actually think that families, as you mentioned in your own case, learned a lot because there are an awful lot of people who had never spent that much time in 1 year alone, home with their children. So many different aspects of the pandemic have shaped all of us in our lives. But when you talk about the research and what it said in terms, particularly about the impact of the pandemic and the use of digital media on young people's mental health, it was actually really surprising in some ways. I mean, Tony Marks at the outset mentioned the fact that we saw real issues of depression. So I think it was over 40% of teenagers said that they felt some form of depression during the pandemic. Just because being cooped up at home, I know with our youngest Jesse, one of the biggest concerns that we had was making sure that he was able to spend time with his friends, particularly his close pot of friends, and to do as much normal things that teenagers need to do at that age. And I'm just thinking of your kids and PE and all the other preschool activities, my gosh. But so there was the downside was among teenagers in particular, 40% of kids experiencing some form of depression is amazing. But at the other hand, and I know your piece in Which Side of History talked about the positive ways in which technology can improve lives for kids at all ages. More than 8 in 10, I think 85% of young people went online during the pandemic to access health and mental health resources. So just as I said that education was transformed by the pandemic and parenting was transformed, so was healthcare and telemedicine, which, as you know, you have a lot of background in the public health field. And telemedicine and telehealth are here to stay, and they were rapidly accelerated. And teens both turn to screens like this to connect with friends more than ever. But then they also experienced, as Tony Marks mentioned, more online bullying, more online hate, more white supremacy, a lot of really ugly things. So it's a very mixed picture. But the bottom line is it shaped all of us, it changed all of us, and now we're coming out of it. And it's really interesting to see what the next few years will look like.
And Jim, I imagine there are a lot of parents here tonight who have kids maybe closer to Jesse's age than my kid's age.
Right.
Just kind of given the stated topic of our conversation. And I'm curious, like, what advice do you have for parents to talk to their kids, not only about kind of screen time, but really also talk to their kids about how their kids are feeling about their screen time and about what their experiencing online, because we also know that for kids, especially, it's quite a porous boundary between kind of how they view their lives like in real life and how they view their lives online. And so just what advice do you have for parents around, how to talk to your kids, or maybe even more importantly, how to ensure your kids are talking to you about their experiences online, about how they're feeling, about if they are experiencing hate or racism or homophobia, because we know that Black teens and LGBTQ teens are
Right.
far more likely to receive kind of online hate than white teens and kind of cisgendered straight teens are. So just what advice do you have for parents?
Well, it's such a good question. Chelsea, and it does matter about the age of your kids, right? So there's no question. I think the number one thing, and I think about it and even with younger kids like you guys have, I think having an ongoing dialogue and discussion with your children and listening to them, that's your point. You really do have to listen to your children about what they're experiencing. And I'll give you a few examples of it. I think when we've seen, particularly with kids in middle school and older, they're really spending a lot of time online, whether it's on social media, on the internet, in games, or whatever. I think you want to ask them questions about where they feel safe and supported online. If for a lot of kids really find solace and support at different places, I think that's really good for you to learn. And it's funny, since you've been involved with Common Sense really from the beginning, you know that we're frequently critical of some of the social media platforms for what they permit our kids and all of us to be exposed to. But there also can be the source of great support for kids. So I think one thing you want to ask your kids is, where do they feel supported? Where do they feel safe and secure? I think the converse of that is, are there places in your online behavior, on social media in particular, but not just in social media platforms in general, where you don't feel safe? That's a hard thing for kids to talk about, particularly when they're teenagers. I doubt you did this, but mine certainly have given monosyllabic answers many times when we really tried to get them to open up. But I think you can ask really open-ended questions to your kids as they're older and let them just tell you. I always say to parents, since, as you know, we live in California and we drive the kids in carpools, you can learn a lot in the carpool by just driving and listening to the other kids talk to themselves. But so I think being open and listening, as you said, is key. The other thing is we've often said at Common Sense that if a kid really abuses their privileges with a device, whether it's a tablet or a phone or even a computer, take it away from them. I think during the pandemic, one of the lessons we really learned, but it wasn't that good an idea, that was a lifeline for a lot of kids and the center of their social life and of their social emotional development. So I think we relaxed our thinking. I certainly relaxed my thinking in that way. And the other thing is, which I think is always true from a mental health standpoint, is if your kid is struggling in general offline, when they're not in front of a screen, then pay attention to the social media platforms in particular that they're on, because that can either cause or exacerbate some of the mental health challenges that kids are facing. So those are just a few things I would say.
Well, and Jim, excuse me, I think one of the things that I was really struck by, or have been, is probably the appropriate verb tense, struck by over the last few years of the Common Sense media research and from others is that not all screen time is equal. Whereas
Exactly.
I think, when you and I were working on kind of what are the appropriate amounts of TV time for kids,
for the other parent,
for the other parent almost 20 years ago, which is wild for me to think about.
Me too.
And then it was, a less complex equation, because we were talking about television, a little bit about video games, but largely about television. And now there are so many different types and sizes of screens that kind of facilitate or enable so many different ways to interact with technology and with content. I just wonder if you could share some reflections on how your views on screen time have changed, even pre-pandemic, given that no two screens are created equal, I guess.
It's so true, and Chelsea, I remember, for the audience, I'm referring back to a book that Chelsea worked very closely with me on that came out in 2002. And it basically created the launch of Common Sense Media. It was called The Other Parent.
Because
And
I was Jim's research assistant.
that's correct. And and she was a great one, let me tell you. And the truth is that book really launched Common Sense Media. I remember your dad asked me one time, I won't try to imitate him, but he was like, well, if you're doing all this, why don't you just start an organization that will focus on this? Because he was interviewed for the book. And it was a seminal moment for me when your dad asked me that question, because that really in some ways led to Common Sense Media, which is pretty remarkable. But I think the one thing is, in those days, we were talking about movies, TV, and video games. And now we're talking about Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat and YouTube and a bunch of platforms that in those days didn't even exist. So screen time is very, very different. And I think at Common Sense, we've gone through an evolution too, up even pre-pandemic, as you said, because the genie's out of the bottle and screens are here to stay. They're an incredibly important aspect of people's lives. Now, I do think personally that all parents and all educators and all of us, including young people, need to be really careful about the amount of time we spend in front of a screen. And because I could cite you chapter and verse about some of the impacts of too much screen time, not just on brain development for younger children like yours, Chelsea, but also on the social, emotional, and cognitive development of children. And unhealthy content, as you were saying, you said it's not just how much time, it's what kids are being exposed to. And there is a ton of bad stuff out there. There's a ton of bad content that kids, even as young as preschoolers, can be exposed to if they're allowed to just roam free on different social media and internet platforms. But I do think that what we saw during the pandemic in particular was that not just that screens can be a lifeline socially for people, but that they can also guide you to really positive experiences. I've meditated since college, but one of the things that I saw happen over the last couple of years is now there are some much more online meditation apps and that have become very popular and have, in a sense, guided people into areas of behavior that I think can be very healthy for your social emotional life and very good for your physical well-being too, like meditation. And so, and there have been other apps like A Part of Me, which is helps young people and all of us work through loss and grief in our lives. So it's quite interesting to see the downsides and the fact that we still need as parents and educators to have rules and advice and an ongoing dialogue with our children, but also that there are really good things to point them to. And I think this is an ever-evolving digital universe. And it's just been accelerated by the last 15 months of the pandemic.
Well, and I think your point is a particularly important one, Jim, because for so many parents and other caregivers, they have to have some. I mean, I think we can't frame it any other way. They have to have some ability to have a child like watch something or play with the device while they're making dinner or doing laundry or cleaning up. And so I think that we also just have to be really cognizant of the lived realities of so many people and so many families. And I'm really struck listening to you though, Jim, about kind of Sesame Street's posture on this, which is that they very much are kind of largely for 2 to 5 year olds.
Right.
They're not for younger than 2. And while they can be kind of fun and entertaining, maybe for slightly older kids, they are built kind of in their marrow, in their DNA, kind of to help prepare kids for kindergarten, prepare kids, from a early literacy standpoint, an early numeracy standpoint, a social emotional development standpoint. But I've always really appreciated how clear they are about what they're not.
Yep.
And so listening to you now, I wonder if you think, are we going toward a place where there will be greater delineations about what is appropriate and where kind of that isn't just coming from, common sense and our kind of friends in the academic community, but maybe from content creators and tech companies themselves?
I certainly hope so. And I'm pretty optimistic that we are. This all happened at warp speed, if you think about it. I've given any number of talks where I said, the last time there was a privacy law in the United States, Mark Zuckerberg was in diapers. Or the last time, this is actually true, the government, I will say, in the 21 years of this century, our government has been missing in action in terms of regulating media and technology. So you've had a pretty much of a wild, wild west environment, and many, many things have happened. And I think if you look over the past 20 years, there's been a remarkable shift. When we first started working on the book, The Other Parent, there's been a remarkable shift, actually. And so I do think that number one, today, little kids even primarily are drawn to platforms like YouTube and TikTok, as opposed to growing up on, you still have the gold standards of stuff like Sesame Street or PBS Kids. But in the old day, 20 years ago, kids spent most of their time, if they're in front of a screen, particularly younger kids, watching either Nickelodeon or Nick Jr. or Disney Channel or Playhouse Disney, stuff like that. Now, increasingly, you see them on social media platforms, many of which, by the way, are not appropriate for them. But that said, you do see content creators now who've shifted over to those platforms who create really great stuff. And one of the things, actually, over the last couple of years, it's really changed the way Common Sense Media has approached this issue. Because over the past decade, we were quite critical of big platforms like Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, et cetera, took them on. As you know, you also worked on a book with me called Talking Back to Facebook back in which came out in 2012, where we were quite critical of some of the kinds of things that could happen, particularly on social media platforms. But I think what we're seeing is the evolution to digital everywhere, and that kids and adults are now living their lives on social media platforms and other internet. And therefore, you're getting much more high quality content that's migrated there. And of the kind of that has the sort of the bones of Sesame Street, with extraordinary research and cognitive and social emotional development, thinking and expertise underlying it. So I'm pretty optimistic that we're going to see more and more of that. We're actually at Common Sense now, and not just, if you will, it's a carrot and stick approach. The stick being, we're going to regulate you if you don't do a good job. And we're going to go to the federal government and to the state governments in times and say, please regulate these folks. They're creating an unhealthy environment for our children. But on the other hand, we've now worked closely with most of the social media platforms to say, here's how you can clean up that platform. Here's how you can curate healthy, safe, high quality content for children, particularly younger children, but also for, I think, kids up through middle school and even teens. So I think we're seeing a change because people in the creative community, even at the executive level among the technology companies, but parents are so much more familiar now with the platforms, and they're insisting on higher quality, and they're insisting on rules of the road. And I'm optimistic. I think we need a broad governmental framework for this, by the way. I actually do. As you know from my
I do too.
as a Stanford prof, I just believe we need a broad governmental framework. But that said, I'm very encouraged by some of the behavior of the tech platforms, particularly as more and more women, I am not kidding, as more and more women enter leadership roles at some of the major internet companies and social media companies, better things are happening because they're more conscious of the impact on children. And some of the platforms, but not all, are maturing. It's a really interesting time. And a lot of it comes from the public holding those platforms accountable.
Jim, I do want to ask about your views on what that broad kind of regulatory framework should look like, and also, just own up to kind of my perspective, which I think is quite similar. That it certainly is not only the government's right, but really the government's job. Correct. To regulate the tech sector kind of more robustly than it has really since its inception. And I feel this way not only as a kind of early childhood advocate, similar to Jim, but also as a public health advocate. It has been very painful to me over the last many years to watch the flourishing of anti-vaccine content across the social media platforms. And it's been especially painful to watch not only the anti-vaccine content around COVID, but really the kind of anti-science and kind of the rejection of science content really flourish quite painfully, often in violation of the company's own stated standards. I mean, really explicitly in, the case of kind of COVID-19, both the disease as well as in the vaccines, Facebook has repeatedly said they would take down content that was contrary to public health officials' kind of current and best advice and guidance. And yet repeatedly they failed to do so. I feel a little bit comfortable kind of on ground here, Jim, because I've never asked them to take down any of the rather insane things that you can find about me on Facebook.
I was about to say, you've been on the receiving end personally so much.
I've like had children that I've never met. I've been married to people I never knew existed. I'm sure I've been in places and on planets maybe that, I've never been lucky enough to visit. And yet, like, that has never bothered me, because I actually think it's important that people be able to say whatever they want about kind of those with power, whether kind of, political power, celebrity power, financial power, power of prestige, et cetera. But I think it's also really important that we don't allow kind of, public health mis and malinformation to kind of run unchecked and to reach, many, many, many millions of people, particularly in a pandemic. So, I feel this way quite strongly. I know that you have thought about this, so deeply over truly decades. So what do you think like such a framework would look like, and kind of what effect do you think it would have?
Well, it's a great question. And the one thing I'd say is at the outset, as much as I respect and know quite well a number of the people who run the big tech and media companies in the United States, and know them as individuals and know that they also are caring parents, I do not believe that tech, I don't think any industry is going to self-regulate. I believe that it is the role of government, it's the responsibility of government to set guidelines and a framework, particularly when you have the extraordinary power and influence that now exists among a handful of really large tech and media companies in this society. So the idea of a sort of an unregulated tech universe makes no sense whatsoever to me. And I don't know, I think that after discussions with President Biden and our old friend Bruce Reed, whom you've known because he's worked for your dad and he knows your mom and your dad. And he is now, the deputy chief of staff and helping run the country. But he worked at Common Sense Media for 4 years as my closest ally. In conversations with the White House and the Federal Communications Commission, we've launched a commission called the Future of Tech Commission with Margaret Spellings, who was the education secretary under George W. Bush. He's a fantastic educator and leader. And with Deval Patrick, the former governor of Massachusetts, who many years ago was my law partner, and then was a very successful, moderate Democratic governor of the state of Massachusetts, to basically put together a comprehensive tech strategy for the country. And I can lay it out very simply, because I think these are the issues you have to look at. Number one is every family now and every citizen in this country needs access to broadband in order to function, whether it's for educational purposes, job development, health, et cetera. And we've talked about the digital divide for years. In fact, I think the term was coined during your father's presidency by Larry Irving. But still, in 2021, you have, about 15 million students who were not able to go online really during the pandemic and take classes because they either didn't have the requisite broadband access or devices. So one, we really have to look at equity for everyone in a universe where technology and broadband are critical. So that's number one. I think second, I've mentioned the word privacy a few times. You've had your privacy violated. I don't even want to imagine how many times.
Who knows?
But who knows? But privacy is a fundamental, as you know, as I know as a Stanford professor, privacy is a fundamental right. So I think there has to be a national privacy law that mirrors what Bruce Reed and I pushed through in California in 2018, which is now effectively the law of land. So I would put privacy up there. And then you raise the issue, which I think is so important, about hate speech, misinformation about things like vaccines, the undermining of democratic norms and institutions like the election. You had to experience that very personally, or members of your family did during elections. I think there has to be what really goes on there is the amplification of falsehood by the platforms, and they need to be held accountable for that. So I'd say the third major area that we will need thoughtful government oversight and regulation is what I would call platform accountability. I think the other thing is, and you have to look at, are some of the companies just so big that they stifle competition? So that's the other area where I think government's going to have to regulate. But the exciting thing is, can we seed experiments in health, in education, in job development that will change the world for everybody? I am optimistic. And you see this, I think, hopefully in a bipartisan way, that just like we're going to invest hopefully a lot more in roads and bridges and the basic infrastructure in cities and towns and rural areas and urban areas around the country, that we're also going to invest in the human infrastructure of our society. And I think a lot of that can happen by innovating through technology. And that won't just be for the privileged few, but that will benefit every single citizen's lives. So I think there's a robust agenda. We're going to run this tech commission over it's called the Future of Tech Commission. We're going to run it over the next several months. And we should be producing a report and a blueprint for the White House by late summer. And then I think we're going to conduct a broad public awareness campaign around the country that speaks to average American citizens from all different political backgrounds and socioeconomic backgrounds and cultural backgrounds and racial backgrounds, to say technology, used wisely and appropriately, can have an extraordinarily positive and innovative effect on all of our lives. So I do think there's a ton that can and should be done in terms of government policy. And hopefully this commission, which we invite the public to be part of, will help set an overall thoughtful but comprehensive framework. And we need it, because our lives are so different than they were even a decade ago. And our children are inheriting a digital world. And it's up to us to have a thoughtful and really well balanced, thoughtful technology world, because all of us will benefit in the long run tremendously from that.
And Jim, before we open it up to questions, which I know we're slated to do in a few minutes, you mentioned at the outset, you do believe that things have changed now forever, that we're not going back to kind of pre-pandemic kind of tech and kind of tech landscape. And I presume, although it is presumptuous, that is a kind of all-encompassing statement for how kids go to school, how people work, where kids go to school, how kids play, how kids and adults socialize. But could you just kind of expand on kind of where you think we are and where you think we're going, kind of given this increased velocity of change, and that we're not going back?
It's so interesting, Chelsea, because I really do think that the pandemic has been such a challenging circumstance for every single person who's listening tonight, for all of us in ways. And it's had some tragic consequences, obviously, in our country and obviously globally and all around the world, and continues to have. But I think it is going to mark, it's certainly the craziest year in my lifetime, right? And probably most people's lifetimes. And I don't think we're going to go back. And I think you nailed a number of things that are going to change. I think there's if we get it right, there's a profound opportunity to change education for the better, particularly for low-income families and in schools, districts that have not been as well resourced.
So how does that look, though, when we also talked earlier about the yawning kind of inequitous digital divide in our country?
Well,
how does the promise match kind of the reality, or
we're all going to
rise to the promise?
The kids are going to go back to school, and they're really going to go back to school in the fall, right?
New York City, right? We announced today.
I just saw that it was announced that they're going to go back to New York City. Exactly.
No remote.
But they're going to but people have gotten used to this Zoom screen, and they've gotten used to By the way, this is being broadcast on YouTube. Teachers have gotten used to taking content off of YouTube and TikTok even, and integrating it into their courses, into their classrooms. They could do it in a much more efficient, curated way. But I think that schools are going to be more hybrid. I think they'll primarily be the way we thought of them and when we were growing up, but they're going to have more use of technology. And I've seen for people who live in parts of the country where there are snow days. And since I'm a New York City native, and I went to the New York City Public Library many, many, many times before I knew Tony Marks, I remember school days. I used to love them. I'm not sure snow days. I'm not sure they're going to be snow days anymore.
But you've heard, right, that multiple school districts have now said they're not going to be snow days.
No more snow days.
Or they're going to cap snow days at,
We used to love those. We used to love snow days because we didn't have to go to school.
Can you imagine as like a little kid in Little Rock, Arkansas, I used to call a phone. I mean, talk about like real analog technology, right? I used to call a phone number in the morning that had the weather.
Praying that there would be
right, yeah, exactly. And when it was snowing was often the first way, if you weren't watching the local news or had on the local radio, because it was empowering for me. I could like dial the phone number. So, like Little Rock school districts are closed for a snow day today, which didn't happen a lot because it doesn't snow all that much in Little Rock, but it did happen. And hearing that, whomever she was, like, thank you, like, operator on the other end of the phone, deliver that message was, yes, like that amazing rush of excitement.
We got to go sledding in Central Park. What can I say? We got to go down Pilgrim Hill on our sled. We loved it. But I think that's going to be real. I think you're going to see still classes the way you think, but more use of technology in a good way and more hybrid kind of technology. I think healthcare is going to be really different. I actually think you're going to be able to contact a doctor. By the way, when I was talking about the mental health report, young people have learned to go to people who are counselors, right? For counseling online, for therapy online. A lot of stuff has come out of the closet now, which in a good way, in terms of where it's okay to go get counseling and health. That was one of the big things we saw in the research. And I think doctors are going to deliver basic services in different ways because you can see people and communicate. The other thing is artificial intelligence, AI, is clearly, if you're in Silicon Valley, like we're based in San Francisco and deal with the big players in the Valley, not just the tech guys, but the venture capitalists, the private equity folks who are there, they're making $1 trillion investments in AI, not just here, but also over in countries all around the world. That is going to change the way we all interact and the way we learn things. So I think we're at this fascinating moment where we've had this warp speed experimentation with technology and platforms where they were unregulated. And a lot of stuff just happened with no oversight, with the government being missing in action, and with most of us parents not knowing what was going on. But now we've gotten used to it, and then we went through this pandemic year. So I think we might see a much more purposeful and focused approach to some of these areas that could be really innovative and healthy. The other thing, though, is we're going to have to deal with our democracy. I know that isn't really the focus, but we have seen our democracy and some of the norms and institutions that, quite frankly, I took for granted as a citizen of the United States, undermined. And where platforms have been really not responsible about the spreading of hate and misinformation, disinformation, and they have the capacity to actually prevent that. So I think we're in for a fascinating period of time in terms of this, and in both pro and con. And the last thing I'll mention is, because we've worked on it together for a number of years, is you're also going to say that, like the Too Small to Fail initiative that you and the Clinton Foundation have spearheaded, which is really about talking, reading, and singing to little kids so that they can help their vocabulary and become in the really, really early years of life. Well, with the right kind of platform, the Clinton Foundation does such an amazing job with this, but there are so many ways, even with 1 and 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds, to help them with verbal development and other kinds of brain development if we use technology in a positive, moderate, limited way. And so I think the best is yet to come, but it's on us to make sure that happens. It's on not just you and me, Chelsea, and the folks we know in the worlds of government and technology, but for all of us, because ultimately this is our democracy. This is our world in which we're raising our children, and insisting on a really healthy, positive, tech-enabled environment can pay great benefits for everybody in the long run.
Well, and Jim, we spoke about teens and kids earlier, but we also know over the pandemic, stress, anxiety, and depression have skyrocketed for parents, yes, but especially for moms.
Yep.
And we do have a lot of research that there's almost kind of really no necessary technology to help very little kids
Yes.
play, learn, develop. But there actually is real research on technologies that can help parents better
Yeah.
kind of manage our time, kind of manage how we think of our parenting. And to your point about kind of the mental health apps that have really had like very real traction and thankfully like have proven real outcomes to help
Mhm.
support adult mental health too, because we are talking here in May during Mental Health Awareness Month. So I think
Yeah.
it's important to acknowledge the real toll that the pandemic has taken, not only on kids, not only on teens and adolescents, not only on all of us, but especially on parents and
I
particularly on
agree.
moms. So I think that is another really important part of kind of how, if technology is not going away, although we know there are some parts of our lives, especially when it comes to very little kids, that it probably still shouldn't touch. But there are other ways to really help support healthy emotional development and well-being, including for parents. I know we're now past when I said we'd move to questions, and I know we have, as you heard from kind of the introduction, two kind of recorded questions. I think both from teens, so hopefully we
Great.
can turn to those now, and then hopefully the audience has been submitting questions, and then we can turn to those subsequently.
I'm Natalie, a junior from New York City. My question was, social media companies are commonly known to use psychological strategies to make people dependent on their apps. However, by doing so, they're affecting the dopamine levels and the chemical makeup of teens' brains during a stage of predominant growth. Should social media companies be regulated in terms of the strategies they use to make teens addicted to their apps?
Bingo. That was a great question. That's a great question. And by the way, she's absolutely right. And we just introduced legislation. That was not a setup. We just introduced legislation last week from Republican Senator Cassidy from Louisiana and Ed Markey, the Democratic senator from Massachusetts, about what we would call, it's called the KIDS Act, KIDS, but it's about intentional design, just like that question was about. So it's clear that a number of the most successful tech platforms are designed to addict you. And they have developed all sorts of efforts. Our colleague Tristan Harris has talked about this many times. We did a whole roadshow about this about a year and a half ago, where the technology platforms are literally trying to get you, their money is made by you spending as much time as possible on their platform. And so there's no question that they need to be regulated in that regard because they've developed extremely effective, extremely manipulative, and in many cases, addictive techniques, which keep not just teens and kids, but adults glued to their screens. So yes, that should, in my opinion, that should absolutely be regulated. There is bipartisan legislation introduced in the last week or so in Congress. I'm confident the Biden administration will support it, but we have to get Congress to get behind it. But that is a very good question. But do you agree, Chelsea?
I 100% agree, Jim. And Jim, if the student who asked the question or anyone else wants to support the legislation by pushing their members of Congress to do the right thing, how do they do that?
They go to commonsense.org because we are the biggest advocacy group in the field, and we will have we will not only help you support that with your representatives, but also explain to you what the KIDS Act is. So if you go to commonsense.org and you go to the advocacy section of the website, there'll be a bunch, both a description of some of the most important legislation we've been discussing, but also how you can personally get involved.
Great. Great question. Great answer.
Great question.
Yeah. Could we have our second question, please?
Hi, my name is Marion and I'm an 11th grader from New York City. So overall, studies seem to show a negative relationship between media use and empathy, but some forms of technology literally allow us to see the world from different points of views. So how can we transform our often polarizing technology use into empathy-based communication? Do you think there are better ways to use technology to bridge gaps between different communities? And if so, how do we start? Thank you.
Boy, we got some smart people associated with the New York Public Library. Do you want to take a shot at that, Chelsea? I'm happy to answer. What do you think, though?
Sure. I mean, I think the answer has to be yes. So I think the first part of your question we wrestled with earlier when we talked about regulation, candidly, and kind of the different reasons why tech companies, including social media, need to be regulated. And I think part of the answer too comes in kind of Jim's answer to the previous student who asked her question, because in the same way we know that social media companies truly trigger dopamine responses, we also know that they catalyze and then amplify anger and fear and greed and kind of the most negative human emotions, because those are far more likely to fuel viral content. So I think the part of the answer is bound up in some of what we already discussed. I think part of the answer, though, is bound up in what we haven't discussed really, which is in the need still for more and more comprehensive digital literacy programming at age appropriate levels at every age of school. Like I want my kids in kindergarten to be aware of the ways in which kind of technology could be really an affirmative part of their lives, but also how it could be a really dangerous part of their lives. And then, of course, I want them also to be kind of having those conversations in that curriculum in school when they're your age in 11th grade, but that looks very different at 11th grade, than in kindergarten, because they will be, more than 200% of their age when they're in 11th grade than when they're in kindergarten. And so I do think that has to be a part of the equation too. And I think that then also hopefully helps answer the second part of your question as to how do we build more kind of empathy-based engagement, especially now during COVID. I think when we are seeing the real horrors of candidly the world's failure to help equitably vaccinate the world. So while we are, today we reached like the lowest case count and death count that we had seen in a year, but we see out of control epidemics throughout Latin America and throughout South Asia. And so I would hope that triggers empathy in action, not only the sense of real global solidarity, but then, well, what should I be asking my government to do now? Excuse me. So that was a rambling answer, but that's what I think.
It's a good one. And, I like the empathy point in the question. It's interesting. I think one of the things that I don't know, and maybe because I'm older, is I think a lot of empathy comes from direct face-to-face contact and in-person contact. You had mentioned earlier, one of the things that's going to be really interesting, Chelsea, is people may not go back to work in the same way as they used to, right? God bless your throat. But I do think that the focus on empathy is really important. And you can certainly use online and social media platforms to stimulate discussion and dialogue about empathy. But I also think a lot that there's no substitute for good old-fashioned in-person spending time together, whether it's in a family situation, in a peer-to-peer situation, in a school. And what I was thinking is, I go back to the school opportunity. I think that the question about empathy and teaching empathy is basically part of the broader effort in schools to teach social emotional learning. So I do think that there is an opportunity, particularly in school now, to educate young people and therefore teachers, but also even sometimes parents, about the importance of empathy. So I think it's a great question.
And I would just posit that I hope that the kind of real world empathy in action that Jim was talking about helps us then develop empathy for people that we'll never be able to meet.
Correct.
In our day-to-day lives.
The only last thing I tell you is I'm really worried, as you mentioned, about some of the racial antagonism and that's the opposite of empathy, that the stereotyping that we've seen. So I think we have to really put strict curbs on that, and both by industry stepping up way more than they have, and also if we need to, having government regulate some of that, because that's sort of the opposite side of the question.
Yeah. Well, I agree. I 100% agree. And I also think we can't fall into the trap of kind of both siding like racism or sexism or
I agree.
Any form of bigotry. So I know we only have a few minutes left. I do want to kind of, Jim, ask you kind of, because we have two questions, ask them quickly.
Okay.
One is, what is your view of screen time in which teens interact with each other and socialize, like a virtual reality chat? So not posting and getting likes, but actually interacting in real time.
Pretty interesting. And, I have a colleague at Stanford they have this VR lab at Stanford that is really state of the art, Jeremy Valenson. And he has shown really interesting ways that allows you to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. And so I think with things like VR chat, there may be some that's not just posting likes and getting likes, et cetera, et cetera. I actually think there's really big potential there, but it remains to be seen. But I know that there is a major lab at Stanford that I've spent time in where it's remarkable, which allows you to be in someone else's shoes. So I think it's a really interesting question. But I think virtual reality and augmented reality may be a key part of that.
And it then goes back to not all screen time is created equal.
Exactly. And not all content.
Certainly not all content.
Screen time and content, correct.
So, Jim, the last question that we got, I am a researcher working with an institute on populism. How can an institute composed of researchers on populism contribute to the greater cause in line with Common Sense Media? And also, do we have something similar in Europe? Okay, so Common Sense Media has moved to Europe, not because we were planning to, because we had so many people in Europe who started using our services. And so it's a very good question. And the answer is, we've gone over there. There isn't really a Common Sense Media like institute over there, but we actually made a major partnership with Sky, the broadcasting company that's in the UK, Germany, and Italy, to take our basic common sense services that folks are aware of here in the United States and bring them. We also took our digital citizenship and digital literacy curriculum that's in 2/3 of the schools, if not more now in the United States, and we've brought it to Ireland, Scotland, Wales, the UK, and knock on wood, if COVID restrictions continue to lift, I think I'm going to go meet with most of the major Scandinavian countries this summer. This is in Europe, about adapting a digital literacy, digital citizenship curriculum to Europe. And so I think that's incredibly important, because it's interesting. As you said, no two kids are alike, no two families are alike, no two countries are alike. So there's always differences in culture, in language, in values. But there are some very, very basic core elements of humanity and of human interaction. Whether you're living in South Asia and going through the pandemic now in India with such tragedy, or whether you're living in Latin America or Africa, but there's a lot of commonality to the experience. We all want empathy, to think about the last question. We all want more healthy, positive dialogue. And the question mentioned the word populism a couple of times. I think we have to be careful about what kind of populism we're talking about in the context of some of our democratic norms and institutions. But I would be, Common Sense is going to increasingly grow our advocacy work in Europe and in Asia and in Latin America, and provide those services in a cultural and language context that people can use. So, I mean, I would actually end, this has been first of all, it's great to see you, Chelsea. And I just hope everyone knows that you did this with a very sore throat and hung in there amazingly. But I'm really optimistic. I think we've reached this turning point. That's why I called the book, Which Side of History? I really think we have to decide now for technology, which side of history do we want these extraordinary platforms to be on? And it's a question aimed at the CEOs of the big media and tech companies, but I think it's a question that we all should answer for ourselves. Well, yeah, but it's also, Jim, aimed at the young people who asked us the questions. Right?
Yeah.
Because they're the market that the tech CEOs care the most about.
Absolutely. And they're going to actually, because they're natives, unlike old fuddy-duddy people like me who can barely turn on their computers and phones, and you're much more technologically sophisticated than I am, Chelsea. but it's your children. And it's the kids who are in middle school and high school today who are going to craft this future. So if they get a balanced, thoughtful approach to these platforms and to these challenges, then I'm really optimistic that we will hopefully take the best that we've learned, make it a more just, equitable world, nation, but also broader world, and then put technology to use on the right side of history.
Amen, Jim. And it was so good to see you. And I want to add to your gratitude for our time together today. And I also want to thank the New York Public Library.
And thank you I agree. Thank you to the New York City Public Library. What a great institution. What a great institution. And we are proud. We will always do stuff with the New York City Public Library and libraries around the United States. So thank you very much to the audience for joining us. And it is a great pleasure to always to spend time with you, Chelsea. And you got to go kiss your kids and put them to bed. So thank you very much. And give them a big hug for me.
I will. Good night, everyone.
Good night, folks.
Thank you for joining us tonight. On screen, we are showing closing slides. This slide shows the featured book. The cover is burgundy red with the title in large block letters. Which Side of History? How Technology is Reshaping Democracy and Our Lives. The words side of are flipped horizontally. Which Side of History is available for purchase online from the library shop, on.nypl.org/shop-live. Proceeds benefit the New York Public Library. Reserve a copy for free with a New York Public Library card. Visit tonight's event page to find this title in a variety of formats, nypl.org/live. The last slide shows live from NYPL upcoming events. Tuesday, May 25th, 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Immigration History, Politics, and Prejudices. Jia Lin Yang with Caitlin Dickerson. Wednesday, May 26th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. A Drop of Treason. Jonathan Stevenson with Gene Strauss. Co-presented with the Dorothy and Louis B. Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers. Tuesday, June 1st, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Amoral Man. Derek Delgadio with Neil Gaiman. For more information and to register, visit nypl.org/live.